All right, I'm going to go through the informal fallacies and the reading I posted up there, and just to make sure it makes sense, because this is not just a matter of logic. Even though you will hear it referred to as logical fallacies, it really is a matter of reasoning. And so I prefer the title Informal Fallacies. And let me go through it for a bit, okay? Logic, it's really a matter of logic versus reasoning. And reasoning is a matter of reliability. Logic works through deduction in order to establish conclusions. It works in much the same way that mathematics works. They share a lot in common. In logic, if you've ever studied logic, it's a formal field, and it's actually a branch of philosophy. It shares an enormous amount with mathematics and other fields. It won't look the same. It's not used as reasoning in the same manner. A logical argument would be something like, all cats have whiskers, my friend has a cat named Cletus. Well, then you know Cletus has whiskers. Logic is much more limited in its scope. It's much more focused. And again, it's like math. It doesn't include a number of aspects of the situation, but where it works in an incredibly reliable manner. And this is something so you have an idea of what mathematics looks like. What logic looks like. You'll see these symbols used throughout logic. It is much more closely related to mathematics than any other field. It really is a mathematical form of reasoning. So let me come back. So again, it's more of a reasoning issue. In logic, they'll talk about logical proofs. And you may have heard the term mathematical proof, and understand that these are not the same thing that most people are talking about when they're dealing with most proofs, or most proof, or evidence, or if an idea has been so-called proven. Most of those times you're dealing with inductive proofs, and they deal with reasoning. Okay, and so let me cover a bit on reasoning here. So reasoning deals with reliability. That's the term I gave the class before. And it's not a matter of valid or invalid. Logic makes determinations of whether or not something is valid or invalid. You get certainty. 2 plus 2 is 4. With reasoning, you don't get that level of reliability. You never, ever get certainty. You just don't get it with reasoning. You get levels of reliability. So, and again, inductive reasoning is working from evidence to conclusions. You might be aware that the way I've taught you how to write this semester with working from evidence is an inductive manner. Okay, it's a manner of thinking that's actually more closely related to how most fields of science work. Most fields of science require that you work from evidence before you move to conclusions. Logic doesn't work that way. Because it is a deductive field, it starts from premises and has very clear rationales for how it works at each and every step. Most fields, however, have guidelines for achieving what would be called reliability. They usually talk in terms of likely and unlikely, because this is more likely to happen and that's highly likely to happen. In other words, the field has produced reliable evidence. Oftentimes in science, studies have to be replicated. In other words, not to, because the first person was making things up. It could be a perfectly good experiment. But you want to check if the results are reliable. If you do this, does that happen? You need to check it again and again and again under different circumstances by different people who may or may not, make a fortune off of it, or might not make a big name for themselves. So you're looking for reliability. If different people test a certain hypothesis at different labs under different circumstances, then you're getting a level of reliability. That is often very hard to achieve. Okay, So all the low-hanging fruit, for example, has already been plucked in sciences. What they're working towards are much more difficult conclusions that are much more difficult to establish reliability. So you're looking for repetition before you can claim reliability. You never get certainty, okay? Even when something is incredibly reliable, it's never absolutely certain, okay? Discussions and predictions about levels of probabilities is usually what they're talking about, okay? Certain approaches to reasoning are more or less likely to be more or less reliable. So they know that certain ways of arguing just don't work within their fields. Relying on certain types of sources, making certain conclusions. People who are experts in fields have seen it all before, so they usually know not to go down a certain path. Okay, so moving on. Informal fallacies. These are the things that you need to get out of English 104 and be aware of. And these are the things you've heard about before. And I'll go through a short list of them. And I've got a list in the reading, but it's far from exhaustive. I've seen lists of over 20 informal fallacies. I've seen lists of maybe 6. But these informal fallacies are a pattern of thinking. It's not that they're a filled-in argument. They're a pattern of thinking that can show up over and over and over again. And usually people who work in these fields have seen them over and over again, like English teachers have seen words like patterns misspelled. Okay? So they're easily identifiable by the people trained in most fields. For example, within sciences, they often hear the correlation is cause and effect fallacy. And that's in your list of fallacies. They hear those again and again. Within the social sciences and historical fields, they are often examining sources and looking for some kind of independent verifiability. So in other words, if somebody wrote something down, you cannot just inherently trust it. You have to look at where did it come from, what could their motivation be for saying it, and did other people who might have different motivations say similar things? That's how historians and social scientists, including political scientists, examine sources for reliability. They look for motives of the source and whether or not they can be verified. Okay? And the sciences, in most of the sciences, they look for repeatability in experiments. They want to see that if this experiment can be repeated from this one lab, if it can be repeated over here in another lab, if it can be repeated over here in these different conditions. That's what they're looking for, is repeatability. They will use, in the sciences, either inductive or deductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning, you might recall, works from evidence and works towards conclusions. Okay? They start from evidence and they work towards a conclusion based on that evidence. Okay? That's how most people think most science works. It very often works deductively, and you have to watch when it's working deductively, if it has good rationale for doing so. Deduction is, again, closer to the type of thinking you'll see in logic or in mathematics. If you have a certain idea and you already consider it reliable, then you will probably work deductively with it. But you've got to be careful. Some evidence might not fit with the already assumed theory. It might or might not be reliable. Okay, so be careful, because science does work with both inductive and deductive, and the people who are experts in the field usually understand when you can work inductively, when you can work deductively. Okay, examples, for example, are not evidence within the scientific field. They are not, and they shouldn't be used in history and other fields. Examples are demonstrations. They are not proof. Okay. In the arts, they usually have aesthetic judgments. Judgments, that you would use to examine the value of a symphony, of paintings and other things, and of certain types of art forms, and music and other things. It's not a matter of, in the arts, They make a very clear distinction between taste and aesthetics. Aesthetics implies some kind of sophistication, and there are parameters for evaluating something for its aesthetic value. When people are trained in a certain field, say art history or in music, they understand why Beethoven would be a more compelling artist than, say, Britney Spears. They're not necessarily saying Britney Spears is a bad person, but they're saying her aesthetics are a more simplified version than, say, what Stravinsky or Beethoven or somebody else achieved. Okay? So philosophy works with a primarily deductive reasoning and actually has parameters for what works. There's a common misunderstanding that philosophy is just a matter of certain people making things up. People who assume that don't understand how philosophy works. It's a very rigorous examination of how thinking works, which is why it is much more closely related to deductive thinking than other forms. That's why mathematics is, contrary to many people's understanding, mathematics is actually a branch within philosophy. That's why analytical philosophy came out of it. Theology is actually closely related to philosophy, and it works in much the same manner. It's not a matter of somebody just saying, I believe, and making stuff up. It really does have a history and a discipline behind it. It's not arbitrary, okay? So these fields work in certain ways, and certain ways have come up within these fields for producing reliable results, for producing insights within the parameters of their field, okay? And moving on a bit later in it, informal fallacies, and again you'll hear them referred to as logical fallacies. These are patterns that appeal to certain aspects of our psychology. And a couple of names I'll throw out there are Daniel Kahneman, and I believe I forget the other gentleman's name. It's Tversky. Kahneman and Tversky. If you're around long enough, you will hear about these two men. They won a Nobel Prize. They were psychologists and won a Nobel Prize in economics because they so revolutionized how human thinking takes place and how people go to errors in their thinking. In the end, they examined what they called heuristics, patterns of thought. Why do we always rely on these so heavily? And they seem to be inherent. They seem to be shorthand ways of thinking and coming to very rapid conclusions. But if you're trained or educated in them, you know that they will tend to not work very well under certain circumstances. They tend to work for the person or for a group for a reason. So in other words, it's what's often called in psychology motivated reasoning. A heuristic is a pattern of thinking, and it's going to serve a certain need, either of the person or a group. Okay, that's what it does. Kahneman and Tversky studied them for quite a bit. And what came out of their research was a field within economics called behavioral economics, which has been a fascinating, recent innovation in economics. It's only been around for, I think, 15, 20 years, and it's quite interesting. Things to look out for that show up and look like very quality reasoning. Watch out for polemics and what's known as cherry picking. These are forms of thinking, and they can happen in almost any field. They can happen in history and politics and science, and it's when somebody has already made up their mind about a certain end result. They want a certain end result. They will only look at evidence and look for evidence that will serve that result. I often mention that reality is far more complicated than you want it to be. So the world is far more complicated than usually our simple assumptions or our values want them to be. The world is usually much more challenging. And if it's somebody's coming up with an easy conclusion, you probably have somebody using cherry picking, finding only certain evidence and developing really what is in the end a polemic. And again, these show up in all fields. Okay, a recent example that showed up is a film that came out on Netflix called Game Changers. This was, again, they were pushing towards a vegan vegetarian lifestyle, which I will mention that I actually follow. I'm a vegetarian. But they were acting as if there is no question that this is the best way to go about things for your health. The reality is far more complicated than the conclusions that the Game Changers movie wanted you to come to. What they did was they developed a very sophisticated polemic and only looked at evidence that served their conclusion. So that's an example of a very clear polemic that was recently on Netflix. But it's very important to understand the reality of nutrition is actually much more complicated. And there isn't just one way to approach nutrition. Contrary to what they wanted you to believe, their approach is perfectly reasonable, but it's not exclusive at all. Far from it. Okay? So let me try to wrap this up a bit. Some of the informal fallacies, and these are only a few that I listed in the reading. Let me show you in the reading. And I did not come anywhere near listing all and these were me discussing the different fields. But these common informal fallacies, I gave you one list, but this is far from comprehensive. But these are the types of phrases you're going to hear: begging the question, confusing necessary with sufficient. Those are cause and effect, things in false dichotomies. And let me show you some of these. These are the ones I really want you to have tattooed on the back of your forehead. Ad hominem, or when you attack the person rather than the concept they are presenting. It is extraordinarily common in political science, very common, criticizing the person rather than the concept they are promoting. If you disagree with a concept but cannot come up with a good rationale for it or a reason for why this person is presenting a poor argument, go after the person, attack them. Look for those. Those are very common. You often see this when they mention a president's name or an idea, and then they'll dismiss the idea. False dichotomies are exclusive. You must be either this or that. These are the common one I've mentioned in class is the one between evolution and creationism. That's a false dichotomy between science and religion. It really does muddy the waters. It tries to use a logic or a deductive reasoning. It doesn't deal with indeterminacy. In other words, there's a lot of stuff within those discussions that don't fall into a clear binary relationship. So look out for people who talk in terms of you're either with me or against me, because the world is, again, often far more complicated than you want it to be. False analogy. It's claiming when you have an example that the example is evidence of a conclusion. So one case here or there, and this is the type of reasoning that people such as racists will often use. They'll point to one member of this ethnic group or that religious group and make a conclusion about the group. That is how it works usually. It's claiming an example shows you the whole situation. So watch out for examples are not evidence. They are instead demonstrations. Are they reliable? Well, if they show up a lot, you can have an issue, but there's might be a lot of contrary examples out there. And in most cases, I would say there are. The reason somebody used a false analogy is because they don't want to deal with the complexity that is in that area that they wanted to discuss. An irrelevant authority, and this is something I wanted to bring up, because this is very common now with the issues with COVID-19. People are often citing people who are not authorities in the field, who are not respected within their fields. It's very important to try to stick a little bit closer to people who are experts in the field, And this applies to almost every field: in history, in religious studies, in biology, in philosophy. You want to be careful that you're not getting cited or getting your attention diverted to an irrelevant authority. And let me show you one that's fairly common. This is a gentleman who drives me bonkers, Joseph Mercola. And this is where a lot of people get pulled into this middle ground that I want to discuss. Mercola is a medical practitioner. Like many other doctors, he has been trained in medicine. He promotes people who are not really good authorities. And he promotes his business, his money, his desire to make money, by going to these people like Judy Mikovits, and others who are not relevant authorities. You are seeing a lot of this flying around in the media today, with people discussing where Corona, the COVID-19 came from and things like that. Mercola is a practitioner of using irrelevant authorities. There are many out there. When they cite people who are not experts in the field, working in the field, and you've got to be careful. Many people have fancy degrees, but you got to watch out for them, okay? Confusing correlation with cause and effect. When two things go together without a causal relationship. And this is one of the things that Kahneman and Tversky found seems to be wired into our brains. That very common correlation is a cause and effect that certain that the shots that you give to children to protect them from measles, mumps, and rubella, the MMR shot could cause autism. That's a correlation issue. You get that shot around the time that you would first show signs of autism, around 2 years old, 1 to 2 years old. Many people have made that correlation into a cause and effect relationship. They have no relationship at all. So that's a common error. Red herrings are distractions. You may have heard the phrase red herring, or that's a red herring. It's a distraction environment. In other words, it's not really part of the original issue. It steps away from it to say, look at this. I don't want to deal with that original issue, so I'll bring up some tangential issue. I'm trying to get your attention away from this. I don't want you to look at that issue, okay? And the last thing I want to bring up, so those are the informal fallacies that are really core. I want you to get down. I want to bring up this last issue because often what we are doing is dealing in this middle ground. You're not going to all be experts in everything. You're going to be picking a certain field. You're going to be going into a certain field within biology, or a certain field within history, or a certain field within political science, or a certain field within medicine, or something like that. But you might not know about other issues in other fields. You might be interested in them. Journals are often professional journals, and let me show you one, like JAMA. This is a medical journal, and it's published to medical practitioners. This one's dealing with an issue within neuroscience, which is white matter. Most people don't know what white matter is. Macrovascular events and mortality among people with multiple sclerosis in England. These are highly specialized articles that can really only be understood by specialists in the field. These are written by doctors in this journal, which I've wholeheartedly endorse. JAMA, Journal of American Medical Association, is a magnificent journal. But this is beyond most people's capabilities. So are the journals within almost all fields. We even have journals within reading specialists, and within English, within art history, within archaeology, within all these fields. You will see articles that are going to be beyond your ability to comprehend. What instead you will probably be reading is something closer to this. This is called MedPage Today. It can be read by people who are not experts within the field. This one is actually an excellent source of medical knowledge, and it's written in a way that it is actually peer-reviewed, but it's not cutting-edge science the way the JAMA journal is cutting-edge science. This is written for neurologists. Most of you aren't going to be neurologists. You're going to have a very hard time reading this. But you could read this, okay, on asthma and vulnerability in healthcare providers and all these other issues. You can read these. Look for publications and sources of information that occupy this middle ground and are good at it. Look for journalists that are usually not experts, because journalists can be fooled. They really can. You're looking for journals and journalists who operate in the middle, somewhere in the middle, like the MedPage Today, and there's many other sources. Look for elements of peer review, that they have a track record of reliability, that they don't have interest in selling vitamins or t-shirts, soaps, and paranoia. And consider the source and the audience, both the source and the audience. When you look at MedPage Today, it might be more readable for a common audience, unlike JAMA. But you wouldn't necessarily be able to tackle JAMA. But MedPage Today does have a level of peer review to it. And it might be a challenge for most people, but it does seem to be producing reliable information. Don't well, I call it the Mike Tyson effect. If somebody just goes in and beats up a bunch of kindergartners, in other words, the way Merkle does, he's presenting his information to a bunch of people who could not follow his arguments and what he's saying. He's a medical doctor. He's far more trained. He's presenting information to people, to kindergartners, essentially. You might not be a kindergartner yourself, but you're not a medical doctor. He's not willing to step in the ring with medical doctors. He's not going to publish here. So he wouldn't be respected by other experts in his field. He's selling vitamins, and he's making a fortune doing it. These folks are promoting good, reliable medicine. And again, I'm not trying to promote or turn this into an advertisement for MedPage. There are plenty of good journals out there within all fields, within history, political science, within medicine, and others, where they occupy that middle ground of providing an explanation of sophisticated material to a not necessarily trained audience, okay? So be aware that you'll often be operating in that middle ground. There is reliable information out there, but look for the elements that you're looking for in journals, that they are respected within their fields, and they're not selling you this kind of stuff, okay? Look for the Mike Tyson effect, all right? Take care, you guys, and go through the second half of the reading, which I've published, and be aware of the Cicero issues in rhetoric that he brings up, okay? Take care.